Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the power rankings for Survivor 43 following episode 5, and honestly, the power rankings didn't change that much. Now, admittedly, I am still not super confident about any one particular person, and even the people who have the better edits right now either have some issues with their edits or are so perfect that I don't feel like they are going to be super likely winners. And while we did get some more information about certain people in this past week, I feel like it didn't really change my opinions of these people too much. But obviously, we'll get more into that in a moment. But obviously, there are 14 people to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So, starting off at number 14, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Gio. And this was largely how I expected it to be, where I said last week that I felt like Gio was more likely to be voted out next time over Ryan, and that happened here. Now, granted, this episode did try to make it seem like Ryan was being set up more for a downfall. We did see more of Ryan's cockiness here, but we still got plenty of Gio being cocky as well. And plus, I feel like with the setup in the previous episode, it just made more sense for Gio to be voted out here, on top of the game reasons of keeping around Ryan for challenge strength, and just Gio not clicking super well with a lot of the cast. And we did see that here with Gio and Ryan largely being pretty cocky throughout a lot of it. Obviously, Gio ends up going up on the summit and gets the knowledge is power advantage, which he decides to share with Carla despite lying to the rest of the tribe about not having an advantage, which obviously is bad on two fronts, as it not only allows Carla to go back to the rest of the tribe and reveal that he lied to them, but also just telling Carla about this knowledge is power advantage is pretty bad on its own, as even though he didn't know that Carla herself had the idol, I mean, he probably could have sensed that just other people knowing about this advantage could have easily caused it to be countered through a fake, as we saw from 41. So on the whole, I felt like it was a pretty bad decision, and obviously it led to his boot here. And on the whole, I felt like Gio played a pretty bad game where it never seemed like he was in that strong of a position. Even early on, it did seem like him and Ryan were at the bottom. And he did talk a bit in his exit interview about how a lot of this was because he was an alternate and that caused some people to not click with him super well. They felt like he shouldn't have been there. But honestly, I felt like he also came off as kind of sketchy at certain points. And with him talking in the preseason about wanting to make big moves, it kind of made sense why like people could have picked up on that, maybe didn't trust him super much. And obviously that led to his downfall here. And as I said, I felt like he played pretty bad for the most part. And because of that, he is here at number 14. And with that, there are 13 players left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game, based on their edit and current game position. And admittedly, this is where things get interesting because obviously, based on the previews, it does seem like we're about to have the merge here, or at least the earner merge twist that we saw in 41 or 42, however they decide to go about it this time. So through that, I am expecting the positions here to shift to a degree, although I feel like the person here is pretty unlikely to win in general. But here we have Ryan, and I said this last week, I feel like Ryan could very well be the merge boot here. I feel like he is someone who could easily be seen as a physical threat, but also someone that isn't super well connected to where they could be an easy consensus boot, which, as we saw from 41 and 42, does seem to be the trend during the early merge section. And I feel like if they want to do a consensus vote right off the bat in order to avoid drawing lines too early, I feel like Ryan is a potential candidate there. Now, granted, I don't think it's a lock per se. I feel like there are certain other people that could also be a likely merge boot if they were to go in that direction. But coming into this, I don't feel super great about Ryan. And even if he does manage to survive here, I feel like this episode really did him no favors with him being in lockstep with Gio and him just being incredibly cocky in this episode. Obviously, there's this whole scheme to try to tell Cassidy that he's the one going home, that they should try to put the votes on him, and him just talking to himself like he's the decoy vote and how he's running circles around the rest of the tribe, only to have the rest of the tribe not only see through it, but seriously consider targeting him instead, turning him from the decoy target into the actual target. None of that's great, and obviously he is left out of the vote here, losing his closest ally in Gio, and all this was just a very bad look. And I feel like even outside of that, the edit didn't really do him much favors to where, again, I feel like he could still be an early merge boot. So I feel like with all that, I can't say he's a particularly likely winner at this point. and because of that, he is here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and this is actually the person I had at the bottom of last week's ranking, but here we have Janine. And honestly, my opinion of Janine didn't really go up in this episode. In fact, I actually think this was kind of a bad episode for her, where despite her getting the Beware advantage and this seeming like it could have been a big moment for her, it did seem like it didn't really prop her up all that much. And we even saw confessionals from people like an Ellie and a Sammy and a Gabler all talking about this decision between her getting the advantage and then like doing the challenge to get the beads. It didn't really feel like it was a moment propping her up. And actually, it was kind of a negative too, where we heard Sammy talking about how this showed that like Janine can't be trusted. And obviously he ends up telling Gabler that he unwittingly gave her like an idol by giving up that bead. So it really did dunk on her even then. It didn't really seem like it really propped up her position. Then obviously later on, she obviously goes on the summit, risks her vote despite already having the idol, and obviously it backfires with her losing her vote. So on the whole, this episode was kind of a wash for her to the point where it's pretty bad. I mean, she obviously is on the bottom of Baka at this point, and she doesn't have a vote at her next tribal. Now, granted, the merge could change that up to a degree, but it's still not looking great for Janine, and I really feel like she's dead in the edit at this point. But the main reason she's above Ryan is, one, I feel like she's less likely to be a merge boot than Ryan, or an early merge boot per se. But the other reason is she does at least have the Beware advantage. I feel like that alone is enough to give her some level of safety. Now, whether she plays it correctly remains to be seen, but this is not good at all. I don't feel like she's a likely winner at all. And it's because of that I have her this low on the list, with the idol being the only reason she isn't at the very bottom. But I have her here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have another person who I mentioned not too long ago, but here we have Gabler. And this was another kind of mixed episode for Gabler, where he obviously is pretty clueless during the whole Beware advantage situation. He's obviously the only one who isn't told ahead of time about the bead challenge, and he's obviously the last person to hand over Janine's bead in order to complete Janine's idol. And then obviously Sammy has a talk with him about how he enabled Janine to have an idol, which was all pretty bad. Now he does get to respond to it by saying how this could change the game, how the game became a lot more complicated, and how Janine's protected now, and how all this could backfire on him. And obviously this is all pretty bad. I feel like Gabler's not in a great spot right now. And even if we are to take some of these stuff as a positive, it really feels like his entire story in the season surrounds around taking down Ellie and Janine. There doesn't seem to be much for him beyond that, which is enough of a concern to where I don't feel like he has much longevity once Ellie or Janine gets voted out. He doesn't seem to have much of a purpose beyond that. And to me, that's enough of a reason to have him this low on the list, not to mention all the negativity, all the times where he is clueless, all that's pretty bad. But again, sort of similar to Janine, he does at least have an idol that he can use at the next tribal, and since it expires at this next tribal, he is pretty incentivized to use it, so it's pretty unlikely that he'll try to like not use it and then get voted out with it in his pocket. So I feel like there's more outs for him coming into this next round, but this is not looking good for him at all, and because of that, he is here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have another player from the Baka tribe, but here we have Ellie, and Ellie is largely in the same boat as she was before, where she is a largely prominent presence. I actually find it funny how, despite Janine being the one to get the Beware advantage, Ellie got a ton of content narrating this whole bead challenge, with her breaking down how each of the players are handing over their beads to Janine. And obviously that's in line with her edit. She's been a pretty big character up to this point, but obviously she's being set up for a downfall. It's pretty well established at this point that Gabler is gung-ho against her and Janine. And on top of that, there's plenty of arrogance going on with her still thinking that Gabler doesn't think that his idol's still valid. So I feel like my opinion on Ellie hasn't changed here, but I did find it humorous how she got plenty of content despite this supposed to be a moment where Janine is being propped up. So because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9. And realistically, I feel like this person could also be a merge boot. This person doesn't seem super well positioned, and I could see them being taken out sooner rather than later. But to their credit, they didn't get much negativity in this episode. But here we have Dwight. And obviously, Dwight didn't get any negativity in this episode because he didn't get any content in this episode. And obviously that's pretty bad. Now, granted, Vessi wasn't too big of a focus here with them not going to tribal, so I guess it kind of makes sense why they don't get too much screen time here. But still, I feel like through these first couple of episodes, Dwight has not been brought up super much, and with him not getting that big of a storyline outside of his suspicion with Jesse, I feel like that's not looking great for him. And I could see a situation where coming to the merge, he is someone who tries to flip the game against the original Vessies, but then it backfires and he's taken out that way. He could also just be a consensus boot, someone that people don't connect with super well. So realistically, I feel like he's on a similar boat to Ryan. I could see him being a potential early merge boot, which is not great. And even if he does survive it, I could see him just being taken along, someone who's not in too big a control. And with him not having much of a storyline, I don't see how he wins the game. So kind of similar to these past couple people, I don't feel like he's a likely winner. And because of that, he is here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have a very similar person to talk about, but here we have Noelle. And I feel like Noelle's kind of on the same boat as Dwight. Again, not to get into too much personal content, didn't get really anything in this episode. Now, the one thing I will give Noelle is that with the merge coming, I feel like she is more likely to skate on by than a Dwight. Where obviously before, had Vessi gone back to tribal, I could have seen her trying to use to steal a vote against Cody to try to blindside Cody, only for her to get idled out by Cody using the idol. So I feel like that was a very precarious spot for her, but I feel like now heading to this merge, I feel like she has slightly more room to maneuver. And yes, while there is that risk of her being an early merge boot, I don't feel like she's as likely to be a merge boot as someone like a Ryan or even a Dwight. So I feel like she could skate on by, though it's not out of the realm of possibility she's taken out in the next couple of rounds. But obviously with her not having too much being propped up outside of her story about being a Paralympian, I feel like there isn't much to go off. And because of that, she's here number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have another player from Vessi, but here we have Cody. And really the main reason he's this low is because, well, Vessi got very little content, and I feel like based on that, I can't justify him being too high here. Now granted, I feel like he has room to move up moving forward, but considering how big of a presence he's been so far, the fact that the show didn't go out of its way in this episode to highlight him is a bit of a concern for me. And obviously with the more general concerns, like the fact that Carla could be going after him soon, the fact that he could just be a big character in general and someone who could be targeted as this leader figure for Vessi, I feel like that's not a great prospect for him coming to this merge. But again, considering the content that he's gotten so far, I feel like there's enough there to where he could potentially skate on by. But just due to the fact that he didn't get much content here, I had to put him a little lower, and because of that, he is here number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty interesting figure to talk about, but here we have James. And James is someone who continues to confuse me to a degree, where obviously he got plenty of content this episode, granted not as much as Carla or Cassidy, where you can very clearly tell from this episode that he is in a great game position. He's obviously in the center of the tribe with Carla, and we've even heard from Lindsay and Gio in the exit interviews that it's basically James and Carla and Cassidy as the majority alliance, with James seeming to be a pretty major factor in how the votes are going. But even so, I feel like this episode didn't really do much to prop him up. He obviously talks to Carla about the vote. He even suggests trying to do what they did with Lindsay and just putting the votes on a Cassidy after Cassidy gets a bit antsy before the vote, which isn't great. But even so, I felt like Carla was getting more of the strategic credit for this episode. And yes, while this could tie into his whole I want others to think on the pawn situation, I mean, we can very clearly see from this episode that he's in a solid position. And through that, I'm not entirely sure how much credence I can give to that notion in this episode. But the main thing I will give him is that based on that position, he is pretty much set up for a deep run. I would be very shocked if he was taken out before the end game. And through that, I feel like that alone puts him in somewhat contention for me. But obviously, there's enough red flags with this edit to where I can't have him any higher than number 6 here. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have someone who's kind of similar to James, but has been a bit more present strategically. But here we have Owen. And realistically, I don't think Owen is a super likely winner either, as he definitely comes off as Ricard from 41 in my view, where he definitely got some personal content sprinkled here and there, but it does seem like the bulk of his content has been strategic based, and even then it's nothing super remarkable. he does have the consistent presence to where you can tell he's going to be a big force in the game, but he doesn't have much storyline wise or personal content wise to really back up his win. And I feel like Owen is on a similar trajectory here. But even so, like he did get strategic content in this episode where he talks about possibly working with Janine in order to like ensure that he's safe in case she plays the beware advantage against him. He obviously chooses to give his beat to Janine to show her trust. Again, a move that he gets to actively explain. And really, we're just seeing more of Owen being in the middle here. And I feel like coming to this merge, I feel like he could use that to his advantage to where he could avoid being the target here. But again, I feel like if we're basing this off recent history and how Survivor is editing its show now, I feel like there's a lot of comparisons between Owen and Ricard, which does speak for longevity. But in terms of him actually winning the game, I feel like it's pretty unlikely. And because of that, he is here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I have been inching up in the power rankings in recent weeks. However, even then, I still feel like they need to demonstrate more for me. But here we have Cassidy. And I did have Cassidy somewhat high last week. I had her at number 6 last week. Even so, I feel like a lot of that was because she was getting a somewhat consistent presence, like despite her like not being super relevant to what was happening. Now, it does seem like she is in the majority alliance along with Carla and James, and through that, she is obviously in the majority there. I feel like that's pretty good on her end, but even so, like she is being targeted quite a bit. I mean, she was obviously someone who was considered for a target last week. This week, she was obviously a pretty key target by Gio and Ryan. None of that's particularly great, and we even got from exit interviews that some of that was instigated by Cassidy getting into an argument with Gio, which isn't great. And obviously this week we also saw like Cassidy getting pretty antsy before the vote. She did want to target Ryan over Gio, and the fact that she didn't get her way there is pretty bad. Also the fact that James did consider throwing the votes onto Cassidy when she was getting a bit concerned, like trying to do what they did to Lindsay, is not great either. So it's not as if this was an overly exceptional episode for Cassidy, but I feel like if we're comparing her to some of the other big players of the season, I feel like she is someone who probably isn't blatantly being set up for a downfall later on. Now, obviously that could happen if she does become tunnel visioned with taking out Ryan, but realistically, I feel like she'll come into the merge. She'll probably like cool down a little bit. She could probably take comfort in knowing that she has a majority group. She could possibly take out Ryan right then and there as an early merge boot, and then from there start to focus more on other things. She could start to embody the Fox storyline that she talked about in her premiere. And obviously I have to once again mention the comparisons to Erica. Again, if we are comparing these people to people from 41 and 42, Cassidy is being propped up by the fact that we did see Erica 2 seasons ago come in here, not have the best edit in the world, but have this like animal analogy that allows her to eventually take control of the game. And that is the main thing holding up Cassidy for me, this likelihood that this thing could happen. Now again, like we could get a different style of winner this season. Maybe we could get a bit of a more dominant winner, which through that would obviously take Cassidy out of contention. But I feel like just based on what we know, based on what we're working with, and obviously the fact that pretty much everyone at this point has some flaw with their edit, I feel like compared to the rest of the pack, Cassidy is probably one of the more likely contenders to win based on her edit. I feel like she doesn't have as many blatant flaws to her edit, and I feel like she isn't being set up for as blatant of a downfall compared to someone like an Ellie or some other people we'll be talking about soon. So I still feel like Cassidy has a shot to win. However, I still feel like I need more evidence to back her up. But for now, I did decide to leave her here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and this is a person I've been pretty high on throughout the season. And while their tribe didn't get too much content here, this person obviously did. But here we have Jesse, and obviously some of his content was circumstantial as he did have to go on the summit. He obviously chose to risk his vote, which is probably one of the bigger negatives of his edit up to this point. Where obviously we saw in episode 2 that he was judging Cody for taking a risk by taking the beware advantage when he should have saw 41, and how it's probably not wise to take risks like this. Only for him in this episode to risk his vote for seemingly no good reason, and certainly not a reason that was explained super well. And then obviously he ends up losing his vote here. So obviously that contrast to Cody, who did risk his vote and obviously succeeded, while Jesse was the one criticizing him, risked his vote and lost it. Obviously that's a bad look, and that is partly a knock against him. But in addition to that, I just feel like he is someone who, again, could be set up for a downfall. I know I've said this before, and I kind of gone back and forth over how likely it is Jesse will be to have a downfall. But I just feel like this episode didn't do him much favors, and I feel like that alone is enough to pop him down to number 3. Though realistically, compared to who I have at number 2 and number 1, I feel like he definitely has a chance to shoot back up if he has a solid merge episode here. So I feel like just based off the fact that he didn't have the best episode here, I did decide to bump him down to number 3 this week. Now we're moving on to number 2, and this is a person that, again, I have continually called out for having such a perfect edit up to this point, which probably doesn't bode well for them. But here we have Carla, and obviously we got more Carla content in this episode, with her this time getting the bulk of the credit for taking out Gio, with Gio trusting her to the point that he reveals his knowledge as power to her, which then prompts her to go back and obviously take him out before he could potentially use it. And considering that she's the one who has the idol, it obviously makes quite a bit of sense for her to take that move. Even so, I feel like this was a wasted opportunity for her, where it did seem like back in episode 1 that she was bonding with Gio to a degree, and even Gio himself admitted in exit interviews that Carla was trying to play both sides by bonding well with Gio and Ryan. And obviously for her to throw out that relationship here isn't great, although obviously it wasn't propped up too much beyond the premiere, so you could take it or leave it. But I still feel like there's a similar issue with Carla in that this edit feels too perfect. And I said this last season with Omer, he had such a perfect winner's edit for a lot of the season, and then obviously he ended up being the final obstacle for the eventual winner to take out. And I feel like Carla is being set up for something very similar, where I feel like she herself is not the winner, but she is sort of the final obstacle for the eventual winner to take out. She is the person who the winner will take out and then prop that up as their big move coming into final tribal. So I feel like that alone, but also based on what we saw from 41 and 42, where we had very similar figures prop up like this only to be taken out by the winner, is not great for Carla. Though I will say that something I've been wondering is how this show is going to present a dominant winner. Obviously, in 41 and 42, we did see those seasons have mostly under the radar winners where they weren't in too much control for a lot of the game, but obviously became more powerful as the game went on, but ultimately winners that were not too out in front for a lot of it. Whereas now, there's obviously no guarantee that we're going to have a same style winner this time. And I feel like that possibility is enough to have someone like Carla in high contention, as we do know that she is playing a very solid game right now. And if she is going to win in dominant fashion, then we could expect the show to edit them in a slightly different way. There is a chance that we could have a dominant winner, and there's a chance that the show is just playing with these tropes and archetypes that it's set up through 41 and 42 in order to mess with our expectations. So I feel like that is the one rationale that could explain a potential Carla win, but simply the fact that she is so prominent in the edit right now is not good in my eyes, and I feel like that alone is enough to make me hesitate, and it's because of that I have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the player I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 43 right now is Sammy. Now, realistically, my view of Sammy hasn't changed too much. Now, obviously, he did get a decent amount of content here, despite him not being super pivotal, where he obviously narrates a lot of his thoughts while Janine is collecting all the beads, and he's obviously the one to tell Gabler that he screwed up by giving his bead to Janine, which, again, is a mostly strategic moment, and it obviously fuels this whole conflict between Gabler and Ellie / Janine. Though something that's a little weird in this episode is the fact that Sammy didn't tell him this before everyone was giving them the beads, where obviously we did see Janine telling the others before she came up with this whole scheme to tell everyone to give them their beads. So the fact that Sammy didn't decide to tell Gabler before they were giving up all their beads is a bit suspect. And obviously the fact that Sammy even gives up his bead without explaining it too much is a little strange as well. And I feel like that largely characterizes Sammy's edit so far, where for the most part, it's pretty positive. And I feel like there is plenty of content to justify him making a deep run. I am pretty much convinced at this point that he is almost guaranteed to make Final Tribal at this point. And I know that if I'm wrong and he's taken out soon, that people will come back to this and make fun of me, which again, I'm fine with. But I feel like just based on the edit he's gotten so far, I feel like Sammy is being set up for a very deep run, someone who is probably likely to get to the end of the game. It's just whether this is going to be a winner's edit or not. Now, I did present this possibility last week that maybe he could be a runner-up, someone whose game is mostly explained pretty well, and someone who is propped up in the first half, but their flaws just become bigger and bigger. And I feel like we've seen through this pre-merge that despite all these positives, there are these little knocks here and there that you can point to in Sammy's edit. Obviously in the premiere, you have him saying that he wanted to do the sweat challenge but not getting his way. You have him saying that he didn't want to show off his intellect during said challenge, only to be the one to solve the puzzle. You have little moments like that that really makes you question how solid this edit could be. Now, obviously, the flip side to that is you go to someone like Carla, someone who has such a blatant and perfect winner's edit that it makes me suspicious. So obviously, one would expect that I would ask for a little knocks to make me maybe second guess, or at least make most of the audience second guess, when in reality, all that does is reinforce that they're the winner. So I feel like it's a bit of a back and forth between how much of this is the editors trying to throw us off to the potential winner, trying to make it not a perfect winner's edit, or if it's just foreshadowing towards flaws like this becoming bigger and bigger over time to eventually explain to us why this person ends up losing at the end. So I feel like that's the big dilemma I've been having with Sammy throughout a lot of this season, despite me feeling like he's going to have such a deep run. I am, for this week, going to lean more towards him getting deeper in the game. And I feel like that's largely the reason he is at number one, is that I feel like he's the most likely person to make it to the very end of the game in a spot to where he could explain his game pretty well, and potentially play a big enough game to potentially impress the jury. It's just whether these little knocks and little flaws are going to add up over time to eventually cost him jury votes. So again, it's not as if I'm super confident on Sammy, and really, as I've explained throughout this video, I'm not super confident on anyone really right now, and even the people that I feel like are more likely are people that I feel like could have downfalls, or people that could have bigger issues crop up later on. But simply coming into the merge of this season, based on everything that we know right now, I am deciding to put Sammy here at number one, though if history serves, that's probably going to change next week. But for now, he is here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings once again, so stay tuned for that. I am also covering the Amazing Race 34 right now, and also doing power rankings for that, so stay tuned for those. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave the link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.